I have Daniel Russo here with me to share some of his stories. He's a fifth generation pioneer from Spanish Florida, right?
Yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit about that? How your family?
Yeah, my family came down from Georgia, where they had settled not too long after the Revolutionary War in the late 1700s. They settled in Georgia, and then they won the land lottery in Georgia, and they established several large plots of land. And in the early 1800s, of course, after Jackson brought his troops in against the Seminoles in 1817, it was shortly after that that a lot of settlers began to come in from Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, and started to trickle down into Florida. And my family was one of them. And John Lewis Rousseau was my triple great-grandfather, quite a scoundrel as it turned out, was one of the ones that immigrated in. And they came down with the Carver family, the Clemens, several of the early pioneer families. And usually families traveled that way. They would come down in a group. And of course they often intermarried, those families did, and mine among them. And my great-grandfather, William Henry Rousseau, was either born in Georgia or he was born in Florida. Some documents say one, some documents say the other. And I always liken that to traveling down I-95. How do you know when you enter Florida? Well, you don't unless you see a big sign on the highway. Exactly. And of course, there were no big signs along the trails in the early 1800s. So therefore, some documents say Florida, some say Georgia. But anyhow, he was basically he was raised, whether he was born in Florida or not, from a small boyhood, he was raised in Florida, up near Sewanee Springs in Columbia, what was then Columbia County. When he came of age when he turned 18 years old, it coincided with the outbreak of the Second Seminole War in 1836. He, like most young men of his age, and older men too, enlisted in the Florida militia in the fight against the Seminoles. And from 1836 to 1842, he served in a number of different Florida militia units. And back then, the units, one unit wouldn't serve from 1836 to 42. They were almost like Minutemen. They would call them up when there was an alarm from attack by Seminoles. And then when the alarm quieted down, they would kind of dissolve. And the next time trouble stirred, they would activate another company. So we have the records of the companies he was in, and he was in quite a few of them. We know he was at the Battle of Wahoo Swamp, which is in what is now Sumter County. We know from the pay records that his horse was killed from beneath him. So luckily he survived to become my great-great-grandfather. Now, as he got older, he eventually ran for office. He was a state representative to Tallahassee from Columbia County. And in 1858, he co-sponsored the legislation that formed Sewanee County. And so part of Columbia County was broken off to form Sewanee County, just the way Palm Beach County was formed out of Dade County in 1908. And when it became Sewanee County, he was elected state senator and represented the county in Tallahassee in the state legislature. When the Civil War came along, he was a lieutenant in the Florida Reserves, and his responsibilities were to procure supplies for the Confederate Army, mainly beef, cotton, things like that, the staples that the Army really needed. His oldest boy, Henry Winfield Russo, died in Pensacola, and his second oldest son, Robert, died in Virginia. I may have that backwards as to who died where. His third oldest son was, his third oldest son in 1864 enlisted in the 2nd Florida Cavalry, and a week later ended up in the Battle of Olustee between Lake City and Jacksonville. And so his mother didn't want him to enlist because she had already lost her first two firstborn sons, and she didn't want to lose the third one. So he didn't enlist till 1864. Luckily, he survived. After the war, his father began selling off land for what he could get for it. Land was, I don't think people today really realize how wrecked, how destitute the South was at the end of the Civil War. They had no economy. Things were in shambles. Their major source of labor, the slaves, had been freed. Nobody really knew quite what to do about that or with that. And we're still dealing with some after effects of that today. But my great...
Now, your first, when we were talking before, I know you had mentioned that your people, your ancestors came over. It was 1818. Was that kind of the year in which, around that time?
No, my original Rousseau ancestor, Hilaire Rousseau, came from, he was a French Huguenot, and he was born in I'm just get my dates correct, yeah. He was born in 1765, and he immigrated to England. And from England, he came to the United States in, I've got it backwards now. Let me go back. I'm just trying to pull this out of my head. He came to Virginia in 1701. So he was born in 1665 in France, immigrated to England as a young man, and then in 1701 came to Virginia. And he had two sons, William and David. David's ancestors eventually settled the Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio area. And I'm in touch with a distant cousin right now who lives in Texas, and he is descended through the David Rousseau line, and I'm descended from William.
And William is the one that came into Florida. Is that correct?
William eventually moved from western parts of Virginia down through the Shenandoah and down into Virginia in the early 1800s. Late 1700s. And so he settled in the area around Milledgeville, Georgia, in that general area, Baldwin, Putnam County. Milledgeville is where Joel Chandler Harris was born and raised, the man that wrote the Brer Rabbit stories. So this is all part of that culture that was happening in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So, but anyhow, William's son, William's grandson was William Henry, my great-great-grandfather.
And he was the one who
And he was the one that was born in Florida. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he was born in Florida. His father, John Lewis, and I mentioned this earlier, on an earlier meeting we had. We had a family lore about a Frenchman that was an officer in Napoleon's army. His name was Jean-Louis Rousseau. Sounds very good. The story was that Jean-Louis, after Napoleon was defeated in 1815, that Jean-Louis left America, went back to France to claim his estate, and was lost at sea. And my sister, who was a genealogist, Marilyn Rousseau, who's a genealogist, discovered through much research the documents that prove that Jean-Louis Rousseau was in fact John Louis Rousseau, the son of the William we were just talking about. He was born in Georgia in 1791. After bringing his wife and son to Florida, he abandoned them and went back to home in Virginia and married a 14-year-old girl without ever having divorced my great-great-grandmother. And so what Marilyn has surmised is that they told my very, very young great-great-grandfather that his father had been an officer in Napoleon's army and had been lost at sea when he went back to France to claim his estate.
Oh, that's a better story.
Yes. And so that story was handed down from every generation until I handed it down to my children.
Right.
I even told my grandchildren. But Marilyn has found that is not true. John Lewis, the scoundrel, not only did he abandon his wife and children, but in 1861, when he was 70 years old, he enlisted in the 29th Georgia Infantry at age 70 to serve a 90-day enlistment. And at the end of 90 days, he was mustered out for rheumatism and old age. Well, I would think so at age 70.
Exactly.
But my sister has found out that he was probably married 4 different times in his
Very
lifetime.
Interesting. All these stories over
But
the years.
yeah, but he was a scoundrel. But his son, William Henry, that I was talking about, that served in the Seminole War and the state legislature and so forth, was a very honorable man. They named the Masonic Lodge that he started, they named that for him up in Live Oak, Florida. I think it's been since changed to something else, but it was originally the William Henry Rousseau Masonic Lodge. And
now as I'm listening to you, you are so sharp with details, times, and history. I know that you just had a birthday this last month.
Yeah, I did.
Is that okay to say you're...
Oh yeah, I'm 87, lucky to be here. And
well, we're lucky to have you here to share some of these stories with us. You're very sharp.
And we've had, some longevity in our family. My dad's older sister lived to be 101. They were all born in Boynton, and she was born in 1910 in Boynton and died in 2011. And of course, we all claim we have her genes, but who knows?
And how did you end up coming to what we call Palm Beach County? I know you bought some property, your family. Could you tell us about?
Let's hang on. Just try and wrap up this session, and then we'll get into this next.
Let me very briefly, after the Civil War, when my great-great-grandfather's property was so valueless, he uprooted and brought his family down to Hillsborough County to a town called Clearwater Harbor, and we call it Clearwater now, but it was that's how it was known at the time. And he bought property there, had a farm, and began to plant citrus groves. And he died there in 1870, just 5 years after the Civil War ended. He died a fairly young man in his early 50s. He was buried there on his farm, and that eventually became the Russo Cemetery, and you can Google it right now. Just Google Russo Cemetery. I was talking about going when I was living with my dad before I actually started attending school. And it's hard to explain to people kind of what Hood Road, which is where I grew up between Lake Park and Jupiter, what Hood Road looked like. When we moved there, it was literally a dirt road, one lane, dirt road, straight from the Florida East Coast tracks to the Loxahatchee Slough, about 3.5 miles. And on that entire 3.5 miles, there were 8 families lived on Hood Road, a total of 8 families. Most of them farmers, some of them had cattle. Mr. Bonnet had cattle. But it's so hard to explain to people what that life was like. And for me as a kid, I went from living just west of Lake Worth, which is, even at that time was a lot of houses and so forth, stores and so forth. And all of a sudden here we are on Hood Road between Lake Park and Jupiter. Lake Park is a grocery store, a small building that was served as a post office and the pharmacy, a town hall, and there wasn't much more, a gas station, and that was about Lake Park. Jupiter was just about the same, so there was really nothing much in between. And here we were at Hood Road, and I was working for my dad, except when I did go to school. I worked for him all summer. I worked for him every day after school. And and yet, just before I turned 10 years old, when we moved there, I had a BB gun. I already had a BB gun in Lake Worth. But a BB gun is no defense against a rattlesnake, and we had lots of rattlesnakes. And so my dad gave me a single-shot .22 rifle just before my 10th birthday. I still have it. And so it's over 70 years old, that's for sure. But on that grip of that .22 rifle is 53 notches. And I put a notch in there for every rattlesnake I killed. Not a cottonmouth moccasin, but a rattlesnake. And I just did it because that's what kids do. I didn't realize at the time the freedom. I had 1,000 acres. I had to go every day and hunt up cattle and bring them down to the barn, those to be milked. Our beef cattle I didn't have to bring in, they could continue grazing. But I had to hunt those cattle every day around around noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, just as the thunderstorms start to hit. And I've developed a fear of lightning that I still have today. And I remember one day I was coming down, and I was just west of what I call the racetrack pond, where my cousin and I used to race our ponies. And I was coming down through there, and it was lightning everywhere, and the cows were strung out on a cow path ahead of me, and lightning hit a tall pine tree. It was a pine about this big, and split it right down, came right down that trunk. It killed 7 cows, and just bam, they were gone, dead. It scared me half to death, scared my horse. The rest of the cows that weren't hurt, they panicked, they went in every direction. Most of them ran to the barn. And ever since then, I've been terrified of lightning. But anyhow, that was just one of my chores every day. But I also had a lot of freedom to think, to kind of roam. And in between chores, I was free to go into the Loxahatchee Slough. My sister one time, my oldest sister one time says, I was always so jealous because when Daddy gave you any time off, you would take our ponies and you put your supplies on one and you take the other and you'd be gone for a couple of days. Well, I would go out in the Loxahatchee Slough. I had 2 red-boned coon hounds, and I'd take my dogs with me, and I'd build a camp on some hammock out in the slough, And I would camp out there for a couple of days by myself. And I'm talking, I was 12, 13, maybe 11, 12, 13 years old.
Gosh.
And that was just the freedom that I had.
That's a neat way to grow up.
And I also...
How about your neighbors? Tell me a little bit
Oh.
about what was it like on Hood Road to grow up with just a few neighbors?
Well,
and
we
your
did have,
friends and
yeah.
Seminoles that
We-
you got to know?
Yeah, we had no Seminoles out there, but we had, I remember Gwen Hendricks, and he wore a brand of snake-proof boot called Gokey, G-O-K-E-Y. It's made out of moose hide, and I would have killed for a pair of Gokey boots, but I didn't have them. And Gwen Hendricks, there was Mr. McDade, there was Oxner, there was Chandler. There were two Chandlers. And, and Mr. Bonnet, Mr. Boney, we called him Boney. I didn't know his name was Bonnet. And Mr. Boney free-ranged his cattle. And I mentioned earlier that Florida allowed free range of cattle until 1950. It ended in the West in the 1880s. But not Florida. Florida, you could free range your cattle. They could go anywhere, and neighbors couldn't do anything about them. But anyhow, twice a year, Mr. Boney hired me and my horse for 50 cents an hour and 10 cents an hour for the horse, and to help round up his cattle. And so I'd make a little bit of extra money that way. I also made money selling coon skins to kids at school. I had the two coon hounds, and I would sell coon skins. Kids would come out to our house, and I had coonskin rugs in my bedroom, like you would have a scatter rug. And kids said, "Oh, I got to have one of those." Well, I'd sell them a coonskin for 35 cents, and I'd get 50 cents for an otter skin. And so that I earned a little bit of money that way. And then one year we had a hurricane that washed out Hood Road right down near the railroad tracks, and the county came back in and rebuilt the road, and that's when they shell rocked it. That's when they made a one-lane shell rock road out of it. Oh, we thought we'd died and gone to heaven.
And tell me about the time that you met. I know you had this beautiful Seminole jacket made.
Oh, yeah,
special
yeah.
For you. Were they your neighbors, or tell me about that and how you met them?
All right.
Your jacket.
One day, a family of Seminoles appeared on alternate A1A and Monette Road. Now, Monette Road is still there, but where it crosses alternate A1A and the railroad tracks, it's called RCA Boulevard now. You can still find it. And if we were driving around, I could point to you exact location. It's on the northeast corner of that intersection of RCA Boulevard and alternate A1A. There's some condos there now. There was a Seminole camp, and there were two sisters and a friend that often stayed with them. And their brother, and he wasn't there that often. He was older, so he was, more mobile, I guess you'd call it. But when I was 13 years old, I fell in love with the youngest of the two sisters. And they rode our school bus every day, and they went to school in Riviera. Riviera, as everybody local calls it, but it's Riviera. And they went to school there. And I had a real crush on the younger girl. And to this day, I remember her birthday is in February, but I cannot remember her Seminole name. But she called herself Sally, and her sister called herself Dorothy. They give themselves English names. And then later in life, Sally gave that name up and began to call herself Connie. And she eventually married a white boy, last name of Gowen, Gowen. But anyhow, back in my day, I was 13 years old, and I was so in love with this girl. And I didn't want my sisters teasing me about having a girlfriend. My sisters could be merciless when it came to things like that. especially my younger sister, Nancy. Oh, but anyhow.
That's typical.
Yeah, typical sisters. And so what I would do is when my dad gave me a break from work, I would ride through the woods from Hood Road, and it was easy because it was all woods and there were no fences. I could ride from Hood Road down to the Seminole camp to visit her. And so I'd ride down there as often as I could. Well, one day I rode in there, and they had 3 of those thatched roof chickees. And unlike most of the chickees that are just thatched roof palmetto tops and open on the side, theirs were closed in on the side because they were so close to alternate A1A. So for the privacy, and the 2 of the chickees had closed in sides. The aunt and uncle, Jane Motlow and her husband, lived in one of the chickees, and Sally and Dorothy in the other, and their friend Maud when she was there. And so anyhow, one day, and the 3rd chickee was open. It was their cooking chickee. And I remember I rode in there one day, and it didn't seem like anybody was around. I was getting ready to leave, and all of a sudden Jane Motlow came out of her house and motioned me to get down off my pony. And I got down, and she took her hands like this and measured down my arms and across my shoulders. And then she says, "You come 5 days." And I thought she meant the girls had gone to Dania, to the reservation, and wouldn't be back for 5 days. That's what I thought.
Wow.
I said, "What?" She said, "Come back 5 days." I said, "Okay." So I came back in 5 days. This was in the summertime. And I came back in 5 days, and she handed me a Seminole shirt that she had made. And just from the measurements taken like that down my shoulders and across my back, across my shoulders and down my arms, I meant to say, she had manufactured this beautiful shirt, and I just loved it. Well, anyhow, let me go forward to another thing. I asked Sally to go to the movies with me.
She made that jacket. I had to stop in 5 days because I do
Yeah.
want to show
Yeah,
how
she made.
absolutely beautiful
Yeah.
this jacket is, and the
Yeah.
detail on the inside of the jacket.
Yeah, she made it in
Do we
5
have the
days.
jacket?
Yeah, I can get it. She made it. Connie Gowan, and first Seminole princess, and you'll see a picture of her when she became the first Seminole princess in 1957. That was the first time the tribe ever had that contest, and she was, 18, 19, something like that.
So your eyes were pretty good back then, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, and well,
All right, we're filming. Okay.
that's what Carol said when I told her the story, and she said, "Oh, so you only like the pretty ones?" Yeah. God. I remember one time my wife and I got in an argument about something, and she said, "The only reason you played football was to get the girls." Well, I'm not much of a tennis player. In fact, I'm not a tennis player. But that ball came across the net, and I had to serve it back. And what did I say, stupidly? I didn't have to play football to get the girls. A dumb thing to do in a husband-wife argument. Dumb.
No, and did not say that again, I'm sure.
No.
That's how you learn.
Dumb.
Oh, gosh. So, well, let's bring it back to this. That was cute. Let's bring it back to the
Okay.
Seminole jacket. So after 5 days, you came back.
Yeah, 5 days, and she handed me the Seminole shirt, and it fit perfectly at the time,
Unbelievable.
and all the designs and everything.
And you were shocked. You had no idea.
I had no idea, and
And this shows all the details.
oh yeah, and
of the stitch
each
work
one
done.
is a snippet of material.
Each patchwork. work.
And anybody that does quilting
Yes.
will understand
Exactly.
how laborious that
That
is.
is exactly it. Patchwork and quilting. Each
Yeah.
piece
Yeah.
is sewn together. For each color is a piece of fabric.
Yeah.
That is
It's just
when
amazing.
You say 5 days, I'm
Yeah.
really
Isn't that
blown
wonderful?
away. And look at
Now,
this beautiful
I'll tell you another thing.
It all means something too. Each symbol
Yeah.
has a meaning. to
In
them
the
and
Florida
what it is.
History Museum
Plan.
in Tallahassee, in the Florida History Museum, they have samples of her work in the museum. She was so noted for the quality of her patchwork garments
Yeah.
that they have them up there in the museum in Tallahassee for Jane Motlow.
Yes.
And she was such a nice lady, very friendly. She wore all those beads that they used to wear.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
yes.
she used to wear those. Yeah, and they would add. I think I forgot the tradition, but it seemed like they added a strand of beads for every year, and so forth and so on. Well, anyhow, one day I asked Sally if she'd go to the movies with me, and she said yes. And the only trouble was I wasn't old enough to drive. I learned to drive when I was 12, but that was just up and down the road. So all of a sudden I have a date and I have no way to get
That's a
to where I'm
problem.
going, you know. And so Jane Motlow often worked downtown in Flagler Park doing corn husk dolls and things for the tourist trade. And so I told her, I said, well, I'll meet you downtown. And she could go down with her aunt and I would meet her there. And so we went down that day, and my mother took me down. I said, I'm meeting a couple of my little buddies down there to go into the movie. I lied about it.
Oh my goodness.
And so we got down there to the Palm Theater, right down at the end of Flagler. And I remember sitting there.
Clematis or Flagler?
I'm sorry, Clematis, thank you.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
thinking about.
And
yes.
right by Flagler Park at the end of Clematis, you're right. And my mother says, well, I don't see them. You know, of course, they aren't going to see them either. But anyhow, so we sat for a little while, and I said, well, I'll go ahead. And my mom said, no, we'll wait. I said, no, you guys go ahead. You know, you don't have to wait. And so I finally got them out of there. And just as they drove away, Sally came up. And I already had it planned. The movie was 9 cents. And 2 tickets were going to cost me 18 cents out of the 50 cents that I had from selling coonskins. And so I had 50 cents all planned, and boy, that's plenty for the refreshment, the, you know, candy bar and soda fountain and so forth. But just as I walked up to the ticket office, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a lot of color. And I turned, and here came her sister, Dorothy, and their friend Maud. And I almost panicked because I didn't know what to do. Because am I supposed to pay their way into the movie? But the trouble is, if I pay their way, that's 36 cents out of my 50 cents, and I have no money left over for the refreshment stand. But if I don't pay their way, will Sally stay with me or will she leave? And I didn't know what to do, so I did the gentlemanly thing. My mother raised me to be a gentleman, so I offered to pay everybody's way into the movie.
Oh, you are a gentleman.
And so as we went past the refreshment stand, I said, would you like something? And she said, no, not really, thank you. And thank goodness, you know, wow. And so we went in and sat down, and I still remember this. We sat in the middle section of the theater, and I expected her sisters and Maud to come sit with us. No, they sat a couple of rows back behind us, over my shoulder, right shoulder.
A little uncomfortable, maybe.
Like a chaperone, yeah. So here I was, 13 years old, and I finally got up nerve enough to hold her hand, and my hand was sweating like it does when you're 13. And I don't know if girls' hands ever sweat, but boys do.
Sure.
But anyhow, so we sat there and held hands in the movie, and that was a really big deal for me. And I think it was the only time we ever really went anywhere together because, like I said, I had no transportation. Well, the really sad part was that every day when the school bus, because I would be on the school bus, and when we got to the Seminole camp, the girls were usually out there ready to just get aboard. And one morning they weren't there. And Mrs. Green, our bus driver, said to me, Dan, go see if the girls are going to school today. So everybody knew I was friends with them and so forth, but I hopped off the school bus and ran to the camp, looked in, there's nobody in either chickie, and I looked in the cooking chickie and all the utensils are gone. The softy pot is gone, any frying pan, everything, it's just empty. And I went back out and I said, they're gone. There's nothing there. And I didn't know where they'd gone. And so just overnight, they picked up and left. And, I was one broken-hearted 14-year-old. I was 14 by then. My heart was broken. I didn't think the sun would never come up again. But no,
Was the last time you saw them?
Yeah.
Oh, goodness,
Yeah.
that would be difficult.
Yeah, and but it was just one of those, you fall in love when you're that age, and she was just a wonderful girl. She just wonderful, and her aunt was so nice, and her uncle. I would catch gopher turtles and bring them, and I think he probably turned them loose as fast as I brought them, but. I always brought a gopher turtle in there whenever I would arrive, and
A complimentary turtle.
yeah, your complimentary gopher turtle.
So how didn't you have a car or something that you used?
Yeah, and when I later on, well, first of all, before I was able to drive, I would ride a horse to Jupiter to get my hair cut. I'd ride up, because our land stretched from Hood Road to what's now Donald Ross Road. And I would ride from across our land and go through the gate at the northeast corner of our property and continue riding through the woods, and I would come out approximately where Walmart is in Jupiter right now. And then at that time, the Indian Town Road came into Jupiter. It was shell rock, and came in, and it was shell rock, and there was no straight ahead all the way to the railroad tracks. Indian Town Road became Center Street, and it was shell rock for quite a ways too. And then I would ride to the end of Center Street, cross the tracks. There was a building across there, had a barber shop, and I'd tie my horse under the oak trees out there. The oak trees are still there, by the way, and the building is long gone. And I would take the saddle off and put an Indian bridle around his nose so he could graze. And I'd take my 22 out of the scabbard, bring it inside, open the bolt, and set it in the corner. And the old men, they're my age now, but the old men would tease me. How many Indians you killed today, boy? That sort of stuff. And I'd get my hair cut, pay my quarter, and for 25 cents a haircut. And then I'd stop at the grocery store across the tracks and get a soft drink, and then I'd ride back through the woods. Well, then when I got to be 15, my dad he got another car, an old Buick, and he let me have the 41 Chevy that he had. And I could drive that 41 Chevy into Lake Park with only a learner's permit because there was no policeman. They had a constable that was called whenever there was trouble, but I would, excuse me, I would drive into Lake Park to Silver Beach Road and pick up my friend Buddy Reynolds, Burt Reynolds. And he was a year older, and he had a driver's license, a legitimate driver's license. And so we would use my car and my gas, and he would drive. We'd go down to West Palm Beach and pick up our dates and go to the movies, and then go park somewhere if we could. And but one day, I remember the day I turned 16. I went into Buddy's house, and I always, whenever we came out of the house, I always flipped my keys to him. And I remember that day because I got my birthday was on a Saturday, and I got my driver's license that same day, and went by to pick up Buddy that night, flipped him the keys, he flipped them back at me, and I caught him, and I said, "What's that?" He says, "You drive." He said, "I've been chauffeuring you and your date around now, and your turn to chauffeur me and my date around. I get to ride in the back seat for a change." So anyhow, that switched the arrangement in a hurry. So
Corry, when did you meet him? When did you
I met him. He was at Lake Park Elementary when I went there, and he was a year ahead of me. And
So you met in elementary school.
yeah, elementary school.
Wow.
Actually, I've come to think of it, I was just in the 5th grade. He was in 6th grade, and we became really good friends. And he used to come out and spend the night with me, and we'd sleep out in the feed room and sleep on sacks of feed out there. And he wasn't a very good rider, but he loved to ride the horses.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we got old enough, I know what I was going to tell you. Lake Park Elementary went through 8th grade, and then in 9th grade we had to transfer down to Central Junior High, which is next to Dreyfus today. And then in 10th, 11th, and 12th we went to Palm Beach High. Well, in 9th grade, Buddy was transferred to Central and was playing football, and he wore number 9. And so then when I got into 9th grade, I wore number 9. And every year I would wear whatever jersey he had worn the year before.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And
You really were close.
yeah, we were. And I remember they had an old abandoned baseball field in Lake Park at the time. And we collected old used tires and brought them over there, and we'd run through those tires during the summertime. No shirt, just old cut-off jeans. And we went downtown and bought our football shoes at the sporting goods store downtown. Paid $12 a pair for football shoes. That was an amazing price, high price. But anyhow, so Buddy and I would practice all summer long. And it was just wonderful. And then we played football together at Palm Beach High.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow, that was a new school then, wasn't it? Palm Beach?
Oh no, it was started in 1908.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Palm Beach High was started in 1908. And
Oh, and then did you do college? Where?
Daniel, I don't know what other people think, but what you're talking about to me is very interesting.
Very. A lot of this we don't know about or haven't heard.
you know, my mother, I may have told you this, but my mother had been a school teacher. And when we were growing up, whenever we were studying like history or whatever we were studying, she made us learn above what we were being taught at school. She made us learn what was going on in the arts, what was going on in industry, what was going on in society and so forth at the same time that whatever we were studying was happening.
That would have been great with Jeopardy.
Yeah. And yeah, I answered something on Jeopardy the other night. Carol said, "How'd you know that?" And I was like, "Because I'm smart, that's why." No. But no, so if we were studying, like for example, if we were studying the Second World War, she would also have us understand what is happening in the music world at the same time. Oh, there's a big emphasis on Broadway plays and the nostalgia of an America that was fast changing. And therefore, things like Oklahoma were such a big hit because Oklahoma touched that part of America that was changing because of war to back what everybody knew it was in the 20s and 30s and so forth. And so that's one of the reasons Oklahoma, in addition to being a good play, musical, it just resonated with people. And so anyhow, she was very good about teaching us to see a bigger picture than just memorizing dates and getting ready for a 10-point quiz.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Smart.
So I was very lucky that way. And of course, I was going to be a school teacher, but they only limited the class to 60 minutes. So and I couldn't cram anything into 60 minutes. No, I'm just, no, life,
You're a storyteller.
life got in the way. But my sister Marilyn, she went on, she got her bachelor's, master's, and PhD, and she taught in junior high, high school, and at college level. And she taught at Peabody College in Tennessee, and part of Vanderbilt. But
So Daniel, when you were growing up, and like take us back kind of to that time frame, what are some of your memories that was going on at the time? And we had 6 stations here along the East Coast.
Yeah. Well, I was born in April of 1937. And I remember Pearl Harbor Day, as strange as that may sound. And the reason I remember it is because my dad had we were living at Boutwell's Dairy west of Lake Worth. This was back before my dad went into business for himself. And he was foreman for George Boutwell. And so we lived in a house on the property. And my dad had a load of white construction sand dumped in the front yard for my sister and me. At that time, I only had one sister. And for us to play with our little cars. And so we had our little cars out there, and we were making mountain roads and stuff like kids will do. And my mother came to the door and said, "Dan, bring Marilyn inside. Get in here right now." I said, "I didn't do anything wrong." I thought I was being punished. And she said, "I know you didn't, but come inside." And so I got Marilyn and some of our little toys, metal toys, and went inside. And the radio was on. And they kept playing classical music. And my mother, I forgot what she had Marilyn do. She told me, she says, "Go to the barn and get your dad." And so I went to the barn, told my dad, Mama wants to see you." Daddy says, "What for?" Because he was just getting ready to milk cows. It was close to 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I said, "I don't know, she didn't say." And so he came to the house, and that's when he found out Pearl Harbor had been bombed, because it had been announced on the radio. And so I remember having to sit quietly throughout the rest of the day, because he had to go back to work. But anytime there was a bulletin of anything, she would tell me, I would have to repeat it back to her, and I have to go to the barn and tell my dad. Wow. So I remember Pearl Harbor Day. But my dad was born in Boynton in 1912, and so, I mean, he was just literally grew up with the town, so to speak. And I remember he didn't take very many days off being in the dairy business, but I remember one time in 1942, early 42, maybe February or March, along in there, and he said he's going to take me fishing. Well, we went over to the Boynton Inlet, and my dad was fishing, and I wasn't. I was catching fiddler crabs or chasing fiddler crabs, and just having a good time playing by myself. And all of a sudden there was this boom, like a sonic boom, like a jet had broken the sound barrier. And the trouble is, there were no jets in 1942. And everybody looked around and looked out to sea, and right off the coast, it was a tanker in the Gulf Stream heading north, and she had been torpedoed by a German sub. And that smoke was just billowing out of it. And one of my older cousins, he was a couple of years older than me, and he was already in school, and he remembered at Boynton Elementary, all the kids being allowed to go upstairs to the second level and looking out across towards the water, and they could see the plume of oily black smoke. And so my cousin, Buddy Brown, and his mother was one of the teachers. At Boynton Elementary, 2 of the 6 teachers were my aunts. So when I started school there, you better believe I behaved. But you couldn't get away with anything. But anyhow, so I distinctly remember that. And you can look, that also, you can Google that today and get all the details on that. On the,
You knew what was going on.
yeah, and the
When
ship's
that
name.
happened, you
Oh, yeah.
exactly.
And
They were
also-
right offshore.
And the other thing too is I remember we had to put up blackout curtains. We didn't have any curtains. We just hung blankets at the windows at night. And also you had to paint the I remembered my dad painting the headlights of the cars. And they wouldn't let anybody go across the causeways. They moved everybody off the beaches. My Aunt Mamie, my dad's aunt, she was my great aunt, had a beach cottage up on Jupiter Island, north end of Jupiter Island, when it was nothing. Nobody lived on Jupiter Island back then. But Aunt Mamie had to vacate her beach cottage and come into Boynton and live with somebody else. And but anyhow, the other thing I remember a lot, but I remember Morrison Field, Palm Beach International, all the B-17s and other airplanes coming in and out of there. And we also, when I transferred to South Grade in Lake Worth, the elementary school, I remember playing on the monkey bars and watching squadrons of fighter planes go over. You know,
Wow, that's
Florida was almost overnight turned into a huge military training base.
Tell me about Camp Murphy, what you know about it.
Camp Murphy, yeah, that I remember coming up because we would go up to Aunt Mamie's, and I was fascinated because how they had closed off that section. They had sentries walking, and if you drive along that area today, the park it is today, imagine being assigned to walk a stretch of that fence. What boring work that would have been. And they also had sentries walking the railroads because the FEC tracks cut right through there. Coming down from Hobe Sound, they make a turn and come down through Camp Murphy. And so they had people protecting the railroad tracks there. All along the Singer Island, up and down the coast, but especially Singer Island, they had towers, wooden towers, and they were probably about 2 stories high on a normal building. And the Coast Guard would be up there with their binoculars looking for telescopes offshore. And they also had the Coast Guard mounted on, and they had them all along Jupiter Island too. The Coast Guard, I remember seeing them on Jupiter Island. And so the area around Jupiter, the Coast Guard would ride mules up and down the beach.
Is that right?
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
No.
And they also walked the beach. But getting back to Camp Murphy, I remember hearing stories. They say, oh, this is how they keep track of the submarines and so forth and so on. And that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, how you kept track of submarines over there. I mean, I'm thinking, go put your binoculars on and get on the beach and watch the submarines. But I didn't understand radar and so forth. A lot of people didn't even know about radar. It was so top secret at the time.
Sure.
And so Camp Murphy was a high security area because radar was so new. And people just, the general public just didn't know that much about it.
That was started as a training
Yeah,
center for that.
exactly. And it's amazing how much space the military would take over for a base, more space than they actually needed, and that would designed to keep the public as far away from whatever they were doing
Did you see a lot of military presence there, or was that they kept it contained? I can't remember.
I don't remember. I remember a guard shack. I remember seeing a guard shack.
Okay.
I don't remember seeing that many. Most of the people up that area, I don't remember. My little boy memory is of seeing a lot more sailor uniforms than khaki uniforms, white uniforms than khaki.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that would account. Actually probably saw more Coast Guard than I did people stationed at
Right.
Murphy.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So
How about during that time there were the U-boats offshore?
Oh, yeah.
Did you witness anything?
just other than that sinking. Before they moved Aunt Mamie away, we would go up there, and she had a nice deck on the ocean side of her little cottage, and I remember standing on a wooden. Back then, all the milk crates were wooden. This was before plastic, and I would stand up on a wooden crate, and she had a telescope mounted up there, and I could look through that telescope. Now, I could see. Now, I do remember at one time there were 3 ships within sight had been sunk, and with a naked eye I could barely see one of them, but I could put that telescope on them and I bring them in close, and I could see 3 of them. Either the bow, the stern, or the superstructure would be sticking out of the water. And I also remember the day that the SS Manhattan, which was a cruise ship, not cruise ship the way, she was an ocean liner, they called them back then, not cruise ships. And I remember the Manhattan going ashore off on a sandbar, high and dry, just I think a little bit south of Jupiter.
Singer Island, maybe?
Yeah, Singer Island area. And I remember seeing that, and it was so strange because few of us back in those days ever saw an ocean liner. Today you see cruise ships,
Right.
and ocean liners were New York and places like that. Florida really wasn't an ocean liner port, not for pleasure. And I remember the Manhattan, SS Manhattan, sitting high and dry on that sandbar, and you could see the Plimsoll line was all the way out of the water. And I remember that I think my memory is that they had to bring tugs down from Charleston or maybe up from Fort Lauderdale. But anyhow, they finally, at high tide, were able to maneuver that ship off of there. And she became a troop ship, taking troops to Europe and so forth, like the one my uncle went over on. And he went over on the Lusitania. But also I remember the B-17s at flying out of Morrison Field. And the Christmas of '44, I got to go inside of one, and the kids at school were so envious. That was an amazing thing. And
Yeah. Anything else you want to add before we?
I remember the day the war ended, and horns were honking and so forth. The day Germany surrendered, I remember that. And everybody couldn't believe it. I also remember gas rationing. I remember collecting old tires and collecting them for the war effort. All of us kids did that. I mean, most any kid born that was a little kid in the 40s, collected tin and metal and rubber and brought it to the center and, contributed to the war effort. And yeah, I remember that. I remember the movies. I have a friend that was my same age, but he was in London or in England, and he hated to hear the war had ended because he thought there wouldn't be any more war movies.
That's one way to look at
Talk
it.
about a little kid's viewpoint.
I'll tell you. Daniel, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I could listen to your stories all the day long. It's fascinating. Every time I sit with you, I'm learning and hearing more, and you're a wealth of information.
Well,
thank you so much for
glad to do
sharing
it.
all this with all of us here, and
Glad to do it.
we appreciate it.
Come back again.
Oh, yes. Oh, I hope you'll come back again.
I will.
Yes.
Gladly.
More stories?
Gladly.
I know
Yeah.
there's more. There always is.
Yeah, that's the trouble when you start to talk about your, one thing leads to another and another and another, and things you hadn't thought of in a long time.
Exactly.
And yeah, there's a
Well,
lot.
we will be talking again, that's for sure. More to come.
Okay.
Thank you.